They are two of the most menacing rivals ever to haunt the silver screen. Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, the masters of the horror genre, and two guys you don't want to meet on a dark and stormy night. In the 1930s, Lugosi's Dracula and Karloff's Frankenstein become classic creatures of terror. Each role makes its actor a star and provokes a rivalry which will last their entire careers, on screen and off. Frankenstein versus Dracula, next on Rivals.
Good evening. I'm Gerald McRaney. Bela Lugosi hid behind a cape like this while establishing his most famous role, Dracula, a role which made him the most feared man in America. But when the opportunity arose to take on another classic horror villain in Frankenstein, Lugosi scorned it. He was an actor, a man of elegance, who certainly wouldn't allow himself to be covered in 40 pounds of bulk and makeup with a bolt stuck in his neck. An unknown actor took that role instead. His name was Boris Karloff, and a rivalry was born that would endure for the rest of their lives. It was a contest between two humans to see who would be remembered as the greatest monster.
The roots of the rivalry between Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi begin in the shadow of Dracula's castle. It's 1882, nearly 20 years since the end of the American Civil War. A baby boy named Bela Blasko is born in Lugos, Hungary, mere miles from where the legendary Transylvanian Count once lived. People in the town believe in vampires, those evil creatures who need human blood to stay alive.
Lugosi was actually born very near the home of the original real-life Count Dracula. Studio publicists loved this, and real strong connections were drawn between Lugosi and Dracula, so much so that the average movie fan wouldn't have necessarily known the difference in that period. Many of the films in which he was billed loved to give him the name Bela Dracula Lugosi. It almost became a middle name.
As a young actor, Bela actually invents the name of Lugosi. It's the name of his hometown with an I on the end, a town he had run away from when still a boy to escape the strict discipline of his father. He would never return.
He was quite young when he ran away, and very much determined towards a career in acting, although because of his lack of education, he found himself working in all sorts of other professions before that came to pass. Many of these jobs were very minor, menial jobs, day laborers, working in the mines, very menial jobs.
When Bela Blasko is just 5 years old, in far-off England, a baby boy is born into a cultured family. William Henry Pratt, or Billy as he's called, is the youngest child, just like Lugosi. Professionally, the Pratts have a tradition of working in the British Foreign Service. Billy's father is stationed in India when the boy is born.
After his birth, his father, shortly thereafter, ran off to France, and when Boris, or Billy as they called him at the time, was still very small, his mother died. So he really grew up without a strong parental support system, and I think there were many times when he felt very forlorn, very lonely, and it's very possible that these feelings came out when he played the Frankenstein monster. I think there was a connection there.
Billy Pratt is 22 when he sails from England to Canada, determined never to follow in the family tradition of public service. Like Lugosi, Billy too yearns to act. Also like Lugosi, Billy decides to take a stage name. Karloff's daughter, Sarah, says her father thought Pratt wasn't distinguished enough.
William Henry Pratt wouldn't have been very frightening on a marquee, though. So he told the story that Karloff came from some far reaches of his mother's side of the family, and Boris came from thin air. But from looking at his family tree, we cannot find anything that vaguely relates to Karloff. I think each name came from thin air.
In the early 1900s, both Karloff and Lugosi are struggling actors. When things look bleakest, Lugosi finally gets accepted at Hungary's National Theatre. At age 20, Bela's on stage at last.
Lugosi was classically trained as an actor, and in his home country, he was, in many photographs, he even resembles a Valentino. He really desired romantic roles, but often found himself playing mere minor parts.
It's a similar struggle for Karloff, friendless and alone in Canada.
This is your life.
Years later, after becoming a household name, he'd remember what he'd had to do to survive in those early years.
Well, I cleared land, shoveled coal, laid streetcar tracks, did all sorts of things.
It's the era of vaudeville and traveling shows. At age 22, Boris bluffs his way into an acting job with a low-rent stock company. He paints his face with axle grease and puts cornstarch in his hair to play an old man. Unlike the dashing Bela, who wants romantic roles, Boris assumes he'll be a character actor. From their earliest beginnings, the rivals see themselves quite differently. Bela boasts of his theater background. Boris laughs at his.
Karloff rather made a joke about his theatrical training. He worked with all these gypsy troupes, these barnstorming stock companies all over Canada and Western America. He, in fact, used to tell the story that some of the companies he worked with were so woebegone that the actors would frequently skip the second or third act when they were performing because they were tired and they wanted to go home. And he said actually it served the audience right because they had no business being there in the first place, wasting their time on such terrible theater.
The rivals also have differing ideas about their new names. Billy Pratt never legally becomes Boris Karloff, not even when Karloff becomes one of the world's most famous names. He also never gives up his British citizenship. Lugosi, on the other hand, proudly becomes a U.S. citizen and changes his name. By the 1920s, all roads and rails lead actors to Hollywood. Stage work is bread and butter, but Tinseltown is prime rib. Both Bela and Boris find their separate ways to the movie capital of the world. But Hollywood is a glamorous place populated by pretty people. Will the mysterious Hungarian and the craggy Englishman fit in? Neither Bela nor Boris looks the part of the typical leading man. But there's been a hole in horror films ever since the death of Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces, in 1930. These are lean times in America. Sure, there's champagne and swimming pools in Hollywood, but there's little besides lint in the pockets of most people everywhere else. Darkened movie theaters offer the only escape, and a good horror movie is just the ticket.
This is Dracula, the original terrifying story of a maniac and a man who lived after death, lived on human blood.
And in 1931, the horror film to see is Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. Lugosi almost doesn't get the part, even though he had created the role of Dracula on stage. Universal Studios is lukewarm on casting this almost unknown Hungarian actor in the film version of the play. But someone takes a chance and Lugosi wins the role of the blood-sucking vampire count. His performance is mesmerizing, sensual. Women are repulsed yet oddly attracted to the suave, sinister count and the man who plays him.
Dracula. The very mention of the name brings to mind things so evil, so fantastic, so degrading. You wonder if it isn't all a dream, a nightmare.
And Dracula is Bela's dream come true. Bela is unknown no more. Fan mail starts pouring in. The ladies love Lugosi's piercing eyes, elegant ways, and fascinating accent.
I am Dracula.
It was instant stardom. And of course, he was thrilled to receive the role. There's the wonderful story about Lugosi playing Dracula, in which he would prepare for each take on the soundstage by parading up and down, posing in front of a full-length mirror, throwing his cape over his shoulder, waving his fist in the air and shouting, "I am Dracula." And he would do this with a great passion and a little touch of matinee idol vanity, but it worked.
Worked because Lugosi is convinced that this is the role he was born to play. He's not at all surprised by his newfound stardom. In his personal life, Lugosi is a commanding presence, aloof, mysterious, exotic, qualities evident in his early short of Bela being interviewed at his Hollywood home.
I guess I'm pretty much of a lone wolf.
And the lone wolf is the heir to Hollywood's horror throne, the new Lon Chaney. The studio rushes to get Lugosi's next film ready, a film called Frankenstein. Meanwhile, another actor is at the same studio at the same time, eagerly grabbing minor parts. His name is almost as strange and exotic as Lugosi's, though it's a name that means nothing to Bela or to Hollywood. But soon the name Boris Karloff is one Bela will never forget.
By 1931, Dracula had catapulted Bela Lugosi to stardom. Boris Karloff was an unknown bit actor. But Bela was about to make a career choice that would bring them forever into direct competition.
1930s audiences flocked to movie theaters. It's the cheapest way to escape the horrors of the Depression, and since Dracula, horror films are especially hot. Universal Studios sends a script to Bela Lugosi. It's called Frankenstein. Bela will star as the man-made monster, but when he reads the script, Bela is appalled. What's with all this makeup? Where's the dialogue?
Despite what the studio may have felt about the Frankenstein monster role, Lugosi believed that it required no talent, that it was just a bunch of meaningless grunts and groans, that he didn't wish to be buried under all the makeup, and that as a very much an overnight star, that he shouldn't be relegated to playing that kind of a role.
But before announcing his decision, Bela appeases the studio by enduring a screen test as the monster, a test lost long ago. Lugosi calls the lengthy makeup session a real horror, and he wonders how fans will recognize him in this monster getup. Bela begins thinking of ways to get out of playing the part. He even considers getting a doctor's excuse, certain that his personal physician will say that the role is too stressful. Bela never has to go that far. He offends studio management by flatly turning the part down. It's a decision that will haunt Lugosi for the rest of his life. The search is on for another actor to play the monster, and he's found in no time. His name is Boris Karloff. For Karloff, the road to fame begins on a sweltering summer's day at Universal Studios. Boris eats a modest lunch at the studio commissary. Karloff has been in Hollywood for 10 long years, playing small parts in pictures. When there's no movie work, Boris drives a truck. But on this fateful day in 1931, Boris is at the studio. A man introduces himself as James Quayle, the director of a new film. Maybe Boris has heard about it. It's called Frankenstein.
As he said, that day was dressed in his best suit and looking his best, and James Quayle said that he had an interesting face. He'd like to test him for a role, and my father was a bit disappointed when he discovered that his best suit and his handsome face was not the reason he was being tested.
Instead, the director thinks Karloff's face has the makings of a monster. Boris is surprised, but he's not insulted. He's too eager for work. Any sort of work.
I don't think my father's career was such that he would have come to Quayle's attention prior to that meeting in the commissary. But Frankenstein was my father's 81st film, so he had waited a long time to be discovered in the commissary.
But nabbing the role Bela discards is more tedious than triumphant for Boris. Karloff's transformation from man to monster begins at 4 a.m. when he has to report to makeup. For the next 5 hours, Boris must sit perfectly still. And when the day's shooting ends, it's another 2 hours dismantling the makeup.
Not only was the makeup dangerous and heavy and uncomfortable and tedious, but the wardrobe was very, very heavy also, and he slopped around in big boots and heavy clothing under lights, and it was very, very arduous. He lost, I think, about 30 pounds, and he never was a heavy set to begin with.
So Karloff may well wonder if Bela Lugosi is right. What's the point of playing a mute, deformed monster? Boris could be enduring this agony for nothing.
Early in production, he came around the corner of a soundstage one day. He was taking a walk to escape the heat, and a studio secretary came from the other direction. And Karloff looked down at the secretary and smiled, and she looked up at him and fainted. So under those conditions, the studio ordered that if he was going to walk around outside anymore, he would have to wear a veil over his head.
When Lugosi hears what this Karloff fellow is going through, the hours, the heat, the heavy makeup, he's even more convinced that he was right to turn down the part. But when the movie is released, Bela gets the shock of his life. Frankenstein is a monster hit.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
And Karloff's career is alive. Boris never has to drive a truck again. He's a star. And ironically, just as Bela is born to be Dracula, Boris is born to be the misunderstood monster.
I think he identified with the monster very much. I think that he felt the same pain, the same abandonment, the same loneliness that the monster did, and I think that's part of what made the performance so timeless.
Bela Lugosi is in shock. He's handed over the role of a lifetime to the man who will become his most intense rival.
He often cited it as his greatest mistake, and because of that, he even referred to Karloff as his own Frankenstein monster, that he had created his own horrible monster by turning down the role that created a rival.
The film Lugosi makes instead of Frankenstein flops by comparison, taking his career nowhere. Equally shocking to Bela is Karloff's personal popularity with everyone from fans to studio moguls.
Lugosi found adversity on a couple of fronts. Boris Karloff represented the #1 screen fiend, which Lugosi certainly would have been envious of in one way. However, at the same time, Lugosi definitely wanted to escape horror films in general and move on to other kinds of roles. Unfortunately, he found out that horror was what kept food on his table.
And Karloff's table is suddenly a banquet compared to Lugosi's, both personally and professionally. Karloff's monster creates an incredible emotion for audiences. Total empathy and sympathy for the monster. It's a nuance Bela rarely brings to his roles. A dejected Bela Lugosi wonders how things could possibly be worse. Bela will soon find out. With the amazing success of Bela's Dracula and now Boris Frankenstein, Universal Studios is at the top of the horror heap. In 1932, the studio sets up a publicity stunt starring its two titans of terror. It's the first official meeting between Karloff and Lugosi. Cameras click as the new rivals stiffly greet one another for the first time. Neither star knows whether to be silly or serious, so they settle on a bit of both. Starting with this photo session, the rivalry now begins in person.
I can't help but imagine the first time the two met would have been slightly strained, probably all the more so on Lugosi's part, because within a very, very short time he had gone from a real superstar and the only person in the burgeoning horror film genre to playing second fiddle to Boris Karloff, who quickly amassed more fortunes for the studio than he did.
And speaking of money, that would be the next battleground for these two merchants of menace, with the studio fueling the rivalry, making it one big chess game, Karloff versus Lugosi. Regardless of who wins, Universal can't lose.
Ready for the next Dracula? I'm ready. Frankenstein. Let us begin.
The studio had this twosome at their beck and call, and it was certainly a money-making venture to promote a rivalry. I don't know, to promote animosity, but I think that came later, and supposition on the part of people that there must be animosity, since Bela had some difficulties and my father was fortunate enough not to. But I think the rivalry is of studio making.
And soon the studio is making new trouble for Bela. Not only has Lugosi lost his throne, but now another insult emerges. Karloff gets a star contract making twice as much money as Lugosi. The rivalry intensifies as plum parts are dangled over the heads of both rivals, playing one off the other. Just as Lugosi gets top billing in White Zombie, Karloff stars in The Mummy.
The Mummy. Is it dead or alive?
And what could be better box office than playing one off the other in the same film? That's just what happens in The Black Cat in 1934, the first teaming of the rivals. The film about a deranged devil worshipper and his nemesis, a doctor. Boris is the devil worshipper, Bela is the doctor. Karloff and Lugosi show up together for a publicity stunt to audition black cats for the film.
Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, then and now the delight of countless horror movie fans, presided over a cat show, a black cat show. What else?
Bela probably feels like baring his claws and fangs to Karloff, who takes top billing over Lugosi in this film and every other film the rivals are in together.
There was a tension on the set. Bela Lugosi was by nature a very dominating man. And in The Black Cat, he had to take billing below Karloff. In fact, Karloff was billed by simply his last name, Karloff. And the billing would read Karloff and Bela Lugosi. And Lugosi was resentful of this, and he was a little resentful too, and a little suspicious and a little scared because Karloff was such an incredibly charming man. And finally, one day, he became somewhat fed up with the whole thing, and he decided he was going to dominate the conversation. And he told everybody that, by the way, did you know that when I was in Hungary, I used to be a hangman? Well, it got the desired effect. Everybody stopped talking and let Bela tell his hangman story. I don't think anybody believed it, but they indulged him and let him talk about his days as a hangman, and he got everybody's attention, and he went home happy that day.
Along with bigger billing and bigger bucks, Boris has the flashier part in what becomes a hit film. But Bela gets revenge in a final scene Lugosi thoroughly enjoys.
There's an incredibly Baroque climax to The Black Cat in which Karloff is overwhelmed by Lugosi and he's put on a rack. Lugosi strips off his shirt, he takes a surgical instrument, and he says, "Did you ever see an animal skinned?" And he proceeds to skin Karloff alive. I think that whatever resentment was boiling up in Bela during the filming of The Black Cat, he certainly had a chance to get it all out there, and it's an unforgettable scene. He really plays it with incredible ferocity, and it's wild to behold.
1 year later, the bad boys of the backlot are back in their next film, The Raven. Lugosi plays one of his many mad scientist roles, and once again he takes great pleasure in disfiguring Karloff's character in the film, a gangster. Karloff is originally set to play the scientist, but he dislikes the part, so he and Lugosi switch. Bela gratefully inherits what's intended as the lead, assuming he'll now triumph over his rival. Instead, it's a bad break for Bela. The film mixes shocking elements of lust, torture, and twisted acts of revenge. It's simply too much for most audiences. And it's definitely too much for the entire country of Great Britain, which enacts a ban on the mostly American horror films. It's enough to make Bela want to scream himself. He wonders if Boris isn't out to get him. How else to explain Karloff handing off the starring role in a doomed picture? But Boris isn't being evil to Bela. It's just that good fortune seems to be following Karloff.
I think Lugosi resented Karloff's luck, is what it was. And I think that if Karloff were here on this show, that was what he would say. He always said, "I have had jolly good luck." And he did in many ways. And it seemed that luck went out of its way to be unkind to Bela Lugosi. And after Frankenstein, luck seemed to go out of its way to be kind to Boris Karloff.
The two rivals have now made 2 films together, but they never socialized together.
Lugosi very much found himself centered on the Hungarian culture he was a part of. He enjoyed spending time with his Hungarian friends, eating Hungarian food, being immersed in that culture. Karloff, on the other hand, seems to have preferred tea time, playing cricket, and far different backgrounds to have ever really become close friends.
Both love a particular sport, but naturally totally different sports. With Karloff, it's the gentleman's game of cricket, while Bela loves the rough and tumble world of soccer. Bela even sponsors an all-Hungarian team. And there's yet another key difference between the rivals: the way each handles money.
Unlike Karloff, who apparently was somewhat careful with his money, Lugosi believed that there might not be a tomorrow. He had a tendency to let money run right through his fingers. The fine wines, the wonderful foods, the music, the parties that would often go into the night, his Hungarian friends, the money that Lugosi made left him almost as quickly.
When Karloff begins making money, an older brother warns him to put away every farthing, old boy, because this can't last forever. Karloff's cautiousness with cash may come from that advice. It helps Boris prosper during the dry spell in horror films caused by the British ban. Lugosi gets no such advice, but Bela probably wouldn't listen anyway. Bela lives large and sees nothing but good times ahead.
Certainly, when any actor or friend approached Lugosi and he had the money to spare, he certainly would pass along what he could to help out other actors, other musicians, other artists, and he felt an obligation to do so. Lugosi was generous to a fault, and unfortunately, when he needed help, there wasn't that many people around to offer it.
But the most obvious difference between the two rivals is what could be called a war of words. Karloff speaks the king's English.
I leave my secret with you. It is all there. More power than man has ever possessed.
But for Lugosi, the English language is a foreign language and always will be.
I'm studying now American slang. I know how to say okay and cat's whiskers and baloney and how.
But it's no laughing matter. Lugosi's lack of English skills is a nail in the coffin of his career, and no one knows that better than his rival, Boris Karloff.
The only time I ever heard my father refer to Bela in really any manner at all, when he said, "Poor Bela, it's a pity he never mastered the English language any better than he did, because perhaps then his films could have gone on and covered a wider range of performances."
It's the age of Garbo, Gable, Cagney, the Marx Brothers, and in horror films, the age of Karloff and Lugosi. Karloff with his well-established top billing, of course. In 1936, the rivalry heats up again as the studio continues to poison Bela's career by offering him nothing but second banana parts. Take it or leave it.
You're poisoned. Poison. And everyone I touch is poisoned.
Karloff's career is anything but poisoned. In The Invisible Ray, the next Karloff-Lugosi film, Karloff is the star, making over $3,000 a week. He's a mad scientist with X-ray poisoning who kills everything he touches, including Lugosi. Bela's role as the good scientist is significantly smaller, along with his salary, a flat $4,000 for the entire film.
His face and hands will appear like phosphorus.
On The Black Cat, Karloff's salary was double what Lugosi received. The next film they made, The Raven, Karloff's part was half as big as Lugosi's, but his salary was twice as big as Lugosi's. And when they made The Invisible Ray, it reached the point where Karloff's salary was almost 4 times bigger than Lugosi's. So certainly the respect that Karloff was enjoying in Hollywood at that time was far eclipsing what Lugosi was receiving.
The gap widens when Karloff begins his custom of breaking for afternoon tea whenever he's filming. Lugosi doesn't join him. Bela despises tea and tea breaks, an indulgence that infuriates Lugosi, who fumes nearby smoking his ever-present cigar. Bela hates seeing Boris have such clout.
All through his life, up to the end, he would say, I really didn't care for those tea breaks. Like, Karloff always had to have a tea break, and I really could have lived without those, and wasn't that silly?
But what can Bela do? He has few hits on his own. His biggest box office successes are in movies with Boris. Bela is trapped in movies starring his arch rival. Soon Bela's free-spending ways catch up with him. He has trouble making ends meet, and things look as dark as Dracula's castle. It's 1939. FDR is still the president. England prepares for war. But on this side of the ocean, the World's Fair is in full swing.
I hereby dedicate the World's Fair, the New York World's Fair of 1939.
And some silly gimmick called television is invented. But Hollywood takes little notice. Movies reign supreme. It's been 3 years since the release of The Invisible Ray. Time again for a horror film with Bela and Boris.
Well, the studio, of course, had the great joy of being able to exploit these two great horror names. They had Karloff and Bela Lugosi in 3 films, The Black Cat, The Raven, and The Invisible Ray. And so they had the two kings of horror, I guess they would consider them the king and prince of horror, together in 3 films, and of course it was great box office.
In 1939, the heroes of horror are reunited once again in Son of Frankenstein. Boris stars in what will be his last outing as the monster. Karloff earns nearly $4,000 a week. Bela is offered a minor role for a paltry $500 a week, half his asking price. But Bela is in no position to bargain. He's just lost his beloved house to creditors, so he accepts the role of a new character, Igor, a demented shepherd and friend of the monster.
It was publicized in 1932 he was bankrupt. It was publicized after he got married in 1933 that he had $700 in back rent, to where he had been living the previous year. And when the studio knew that you needed the money, they had no mercy. None.
Lugosi's role in Son of Frankenstein is nothing more than a way to capitalize on having both rivals in the same film at the same time. And the studio wants Bela to work only a week or so to further keep costs down. But Bela has a trick up his cape. No, he won't make as much money as Boris, but maybe Bela can upstage his rival.
For the film Son of Frankenstein, Lugosi actually used quite a bit of makeup as Igor, a role he created. And while the role started as a rather small one in the film, it grew, and actually many people believe he steals the film away from Karloff, and that he nabs his own fair amount of sympathy, and that most of the attention draws towards him.
It's a lesson well learned from the original Frankenstein. If makeup is the game, Bela will beat Boris at it.
He's got the beard, he's got the shaggy wig, he's got the broken neck, he speaks in that raspy voice. And it is a splendid performance. And he and Karloff in that film are two of the, I think, the most endearing misfits in film history, the Frankenstein monster and the broken-necked Igor. And they work wonders. Brilliant performances, wonderful chemistry between the two of them throughout that film.
Bela takes a nothing part for nothing money and turns it into a triumph, equaling the score with his old rival. And the two are equal in another interesting way in their personal lives. Both Bela and Boris have newborn children. Bela has a boy and Boris a baby girl. The kids help break the ice as the rivals joke that their children will grow up and get married one day. But the laughs don't last for long. The rivals are headed for a major meltdown on the final film they'll make for Universal, 1940's Black Friday.
The change of roles that occurred during production meant that Lugosi found himself in a very small role, essentially, and not in anywhere near a starring part. So while billed as a Karloff-Lugosi film, it really became another one of these situations where it was a Karloff film with Lugosi as a supporting player.
The film is about a gentle professor who turns into a murderous gangster following a brain operation. Karloff is cast as the professor, Lugosi as the surgeon. But Karloff doesn't like the script or his role. He takes the part meant for Bela, but this time Bela doesn't get the Karloff part. Instead of a straight switch, the studio hires another actor named Stanley Ridges, and Bela is left with nothing but a minor role. Bela blames Boris and the studio. He's insulted, angry, jealous.
If he weren't, it would be unusual. I would have to say that if I were in his position, I would have been jealous of my father. I would have been jealous of his career. Personal life, I don't think, had anything to do with it. I think It would be very understandable if Bela were jealous of my father's professional life.
Bela begins drinking heavily as his career takes a nosedive. It's 10 years since Dracula, and a new generation of kids, Bobby Soxers, find horror films funny, not scary. So Bela begins spoofing spooky films and his own image in them. Soon, another indignity. Bela agrees to play the Frankenstein monster in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman after Boris refuses to play the role again himself. It's another bad break for Bela. His dialogue and some key scenes are cut in this forgettable film.
You really get the impression that Lugosi, with the Frankenstein monster, had meddled in a part that perhaps he should have left alone. It just seemed to have a curse on him in 1931. It seemed to have a curse on him again in 1943, and it just was bad.
But there's no curse on Karloff. Boris is wowing audiences in a part written especially for him on Broadway. The play is Arsenic and Old Lace.
It was one of the greatest hits in the history of the American theater. And Karloff played the homicidal maniac who explains that he killed somebody. Somebody asked him, "Why did you kill that man?" And he says, "I killed him because he said I looked like Boris Karloff." And of course, the theater would go wild when he said that line.
Lugosi later takes the very same part when his rival drops out of the national tour.
In some cities where Arsenic and Lace was making a return visit, the play did better with Lugosi in the cast than it had with Karloff. So of course, the line had been changed. Now, instead of the character saying, "He said I look like Boris Karloff," the character would say, "He said I look like Bela Lugosi." But either way, it worked.
You and I should work together. You mean we would sell the bodies to the doctors together? Dig them up? There'll be no digging. The kirkyards are too well guarded.
In 1945's horror classic, The Body Snatcher, Karloff's screen dominance over Bela reaches a pinnacle. Karloff stars as the creepy, grave-robbing cab driver who sells bodies to medical schools for fun and profit. Lugosi's screen time playing a dim-witted servant is next to nothing.
The Body Snatcher became the last film the two made together, and it was most assuredly a Karloff film with Lugosi as just a minor player in the cast. Lugosi found himself smothered on screen by Karloff, just as possibly Karloff's success in real life had done the same to Lugosi's career.
But Bela's career and his real-life script get much, much worse, as Boris Karloff soon has an even greater reason to shake his head and say, "Poor Bela."
It seemed as if fate were dealing a harsher hand to the aging Lugosi. Karloff was living a comfortable life and was continuing to find work, while Bela was drowning in self-pity. But neither one of them was ready to call a truce.
The early 1950s are bleak times for Bela Lugosi. His career sinks into lower and lower rent productions like Bela Lugosi Meets a Brooklyn Gorilla, a B movie with a B comedy team, two guys impersonating the A team of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis.
I don't understand a word. What am I, dumb or something?
Not everybody, certainly today, is wild about the Martin and Lewis team, the real one, but Bela had the sad distinction of working with a fake one, so not the most impressive credit in his resume.
Then there's the laughable Glenn or Glenda, directed by the master of schlock, Ed Wood. Bela now lives alone in a rented apartment, barely making enough money to get by. He starts drinking heavily. Meanwhile, Karloff now lives in England, working only when he wants to. When he visits Hollywood to work, Boris stays at the elegant Chateau Marmont. But Bela Lugosi's life follows a far sadder script with a new twist as shocking as anything Bela experiences on screen.
By the early 50s, Lugosi's career had not only fallen to its lowest level, his wife left him, taking with him his only son. And Lugosi, with an alcohol problem, with drug addiction to morphine, found himself with few alternatives.
Bela says the drug was prescribed by a doctor for an old leg injury. Lugosi voluntarily checks into a state mental hospital for alcoholism and drug addiction. Karloff learns of Lugosi's troubles in the newspaper. Boris shakes his head, quietly says, "Poor Bela," but Karloff never gets in touch with his old rival.
I think that Karloff sincerely felt sorry for him, but I think he realized that with Lugosi's pride and with this resentment, which he was aware of, that probably the biggest mistake he could do was to acknowledge that he was aware that he knew that Bela was in trouble, because it would have probably very much embarrassed Lugosi and upset him, and so therefore he just stayed cool and out of the picture.
Bela's down but not out. With his flair and showmanship intact, Bela leaves the hospital. He hails his release as the first step on the comeback trail, and he manages to plug his new film.
I was looking forward to work again. I understand that. I had an assignment playing the star part in The Ghoul Goes West. Yes, and Eddie Woods will be the producer.
He also warns of the dangers of taking narcotics.
I would say they should be very careful, should pray, and shouldn't start it, because it's a terrible ordeal to go through a withdrawal. It's the greatest pain in the world.
Some local teenagers are fans of Bela's old films. They're thrilled to hang out at his apartment, and Bela seems happy to have the company.
My first impression of him was just, it's hard to explain. It was just, we were with mouths agape. He was cordial, friendly, very nice person. He indulged us with all our questions and so on. I feel Bela was felt alone quite a bit, and he was very appreciative of friends that would come over and fans that would come over, and we had some great times together. We'd come over and we'd check the TV guide to see if every time one of his films would come on TV, we'd go over and watch the film with him. There was a comment that came out of him. We were watching one of his films. He says, "I used to be the big cheese," and that cracked us all up.
Bela doesn't talk about Karloff except to complain about those no-good tea breaks. Bela's new wife, Hope, tells the kids about a dream Bela had.
He woke up in the middle of the night and started to get dressed, and it woke Hope up also, and he said, "Bela, where are you going? What are you doing?" And he says, "I've got to get dressed. Karloff is waiting for me in the living room." And apparently he had been dreaming about Karloff, and it just became realistic to him. And then Hope calmed him down, got him back into bed.
A few days later, in 1956, Bela Lugosi plays his final death scene. For real. He dies at home at the age of 73. Lugosi had just begun shooting the movie generally considered one of the worst films ever made, Plan 9 from Outer Space, directed by Ed Wood. Wood completes the movie using his wife's chiropractor as Lugosi's double. Lugosi's son and wife decide that Bela would like to be buried in his Dracula cape.
I think a lot of audiences today realize that he had an incredibly strong screen presence. He was one of the darkest personalities ever in the cinema. And he was uniquely his own. So many other actors today and then tend to blend into one another, and they don't have as many unique qualities as Lugosi did and still does.
1 year after Bela's death, Boris Karloff appears on This Is Your Life. One of the surprise guests is the artist who created the monster's makeup for Frankenstein. He presents Boris with 2 electrodes, the ones he used to carefully apply to Karloff's neck, the ones that left small permanent scars for years and years.
Connect electricity.
I order you to open this door.
Just like Lugosi, Karloff works till the end of his life, sharing stage and screen with a new generation of actors.
I'm sorry, sir, but surely I made enough noise to awaken the dead.
New actors, but none like his old rival.
Ready for the next Dracula? I'm ready. Frankenstein.
Many times when you think of the image of Karloff, he's there with Lugosi. I mean, Lugosi, he's there with Karloff. And certainly they inspired each other. They brought out the best in each other. There was just enough competition between them that they sparked each other.
Karloff's end credits roll in 1969 when he dies in England at the age of 82.
If they could come back and see the incredible popularity of their films today, I think they would get a kick out of the fact that they're considered rivals. I think they'd have great affection for each other, but they would say, well, this rivalry is a healthy thing.
When Lugosi died, he left the world fearing that he had been forgotten. Before Karloff died 13 years later, he had the glory of seeing himself on the cover of Time magazine, proclaimed as the king of horror films. They were both wrong. The final score had not yet been tallied, and the work of each man would live on, both in film and in nightmare, and would continue their rivalry even after death. The debate will never be over, yet it ultimately serves to give each man and each monster what he truly strove for: immortality. I'm Gerald McRaney. Thank you for joining us on Rivals.